I think everybody's kind of gotten over the fact, that that's what we are. We're entertainment. But I don't think what people really realize is that in any given match, on any given day, you're 2 inches away from something catastrophic happening.
No one comes close. That is what people say when they talk about the wrestlers the Undertaker trusted the most. For 30 years, Mark Calaway stood in that ring as one of the biggest and most dangerous performers in the history of the business. He was 6'10", he weighed close to 300 pounds, and his finishing move, the Tombstone Piledriver, was one of the riskiest moves in wrestling. If it went wrong, someone could get seriously hurt. So when Calaway talks about who he trusted with his body, and who he trusted to protect him in that ring, people across the wrestling world listen closely. It is also worth remembering that the risk in these matches never traveled in just one direction. Because Calaway himself stood 6'10" and weighed close to 300 pounds, every wrestler who stepped into the ring with him also had to protect themselves from his size and power at the exact same time that he was trying to protect them. Safety, in that sense, always had to work both ways. A smaller opponent had to trust that Calaway would control his own strength during a lift or a slam, while Calaway had to trust that they could handle his weight and force without getting hurt in return. That two-way responsibility is part of what makes this list so meaningful. Every name on it managed to protect Calaway, while also being protected by him, match after match, for years at a time. Calaway spent his career at the very top of a business, built on carefully controlled physical risk. Wrestling is a strange kind of performance. It looks like a fight, it feels like a fight to the crowd sitting in the arena, but underneath all of that spectacle, every single move has to be executed with real precision. Calaway operated through several completely different eras of professional wrestling, from the more theatrical, over-the-top style of the early 1990s, through the far more physical and dangerous Attitude Era, and into the modern, corporate era of the business. Across every single one of those eras, his physical survival in that ring depended heavily on the skill and discipline of the person standing across from him. That is exactly why this list matters so much to wrestling fans. This is not some casual ranking made up for entertainment. This comes directly from a man who spent 3 decades absorbing hits, taking bumps, and trusting his body to opponents night after night. When Calaway says a wrestler was safe to work with, he is not talking about how good they looked on camera. He is talking about whether he could step into that ring, perform some of the most dangerous moves in the business, and know with total confidence that he was going to walk away from it in one piece. Calaway never released one official list called the safest wrestlers of all time, but across years of interviews, podcast appearances, and shoot interviews, a clear pattern shows up again and again. Certain names keep coming up. Certain performers earn something that very few wrestlers ever earn: complete trust from the Undertaker himself. That trust was not given easily. In a business built on physical risk, trust like that had to be earned through years of careful, precise, controlled work. This is not a list about who won the most titles. It is not about who got the loudest pop from the crowd. It is not even about who fans remember as the flashiest performer of their generation. This is about something much rarer, something that rarely gets talked about outside of locker rooms and shoot interviews. It is about who Calaway would step into that ring with and know, without doubt, that he was going to walk out the same way he walked in. Some of the biggest legends in wrestling history never made this list. Some of the most famous names in the business, wrestlers with shelves full of championships and decades of adoration from fans, are missing entirely. That should tell you something important about how this list was built. Being safe in the ring, at the highest level, next to a man as large and as physical as Calaway, was one of the hardest things a wrestler could ever prove. Fans watching from the crowd, or from home, usually focus on the moves themselves. The slams, the suplexes, the high-flying dives off the top rope. What most fans do not think about is the fact that every single one of those moves is a negotiation between two human bodies, happening at real speed, with real consequences if something goes wrong. Being safe is not the flashy part of wrestling. It does not get its own highlight reel or its own chants from the crowd. But it is the single most important skill a wrestler can have, because without it, none of the rest of the performance is even possible. A wrestler who cannot be trusted to protect their opponent will eventually run out of people willing to get in the ring with them, no matter how talented they might otherwise be. Before we get into the countdown, it helps to understand why safety in the ring is so complicated in the first place. Professional wrestling looks like chaos to the untrained eye. Bodies flying, big impacts, hard falls. But underneath all of that, every single move depends on precision. The performers are not actually trying to hurt each other. They are trying to make it look like they are hurting each other, while keeping the real risk as low as possible. That balance is incredibly hard to get right, especially when the wrestlers involved are large, heavy, and moving at speed. Almost every serious in-ring injury in wrestling history, when you look closely, traces back to a breakdown in one of a small number of core physical skills, not to bad intentions. There are three main things that decide whether a wrestler is safe to work with. The first is spatial awareness. This means being able to judge distance, timing, and rotation in a split second. The second factor is strength control. This is the ability to support a partner's full body weight during a lift. The third factor is force absorption. This is about how the wrestler positions their body to spread out the impact of a move, so the force lands on big, strong muscles instead of on joints or the neck. When two large wrestlers are in the ring together, all three of these factors matter even more. There is very little room for error once heavy moves like suplexes, power bombs, or pile drivers are involved. A tiny miscalculation with a smaller wrestler might cause a bruise. The same miscalculation with a big man can cause a serious injury. That is exactly why Calaway's trust meant so much. He was one of the biggest and most physically dangerous performers of his generation, so the wrestlers who earned his confidence had to be exceptional at all three of these skills at once. Each of these three pillars protects the body in a different way. Poor spatial awareness is what leads to cervical spine compression and concussions, because a wrestler who cannot judge distance or rotation properly is far more likely to cause a misaligned drop. Poor strength control is what leads to facial fractures, rib fractures, and organ trauma, because a wrestler who cannot manage their own weight during a lift ends up transferring far too much force onto their partner all at once. Poor force absorption is what leads to joint hyperextension and focal spinal impacts, because a wrestler who does not know how to spread out kinetic energy across their own body ends up concentrating that energy in one small, dangerous spot instead. Once you understand these three pillars, it becomes much easier to see exactly why certain performers earned Calaway's trust, while others simply did not. It is also worth remembering that safety in wrestling is never a solo effort. It takes two people working together, in real time, to make a move look devastating on camera, while keeping the real physical risk as low as possible. The executor has to control the lift, the trajectory, and the landing. The receiver has to stay aligned, communicate through subtle body positioning, and trust that their partner will not let them down, literally. When both sides get this right, the result is a match that looks brutal to the crowd, but leaves both performers able to walk to the back afterward. When either side gets it wrong, even slightly, the consequences can last a lifetime. This is exactly why the wrestlers on this list stand out so much among their peers, even decades after many of these matches took place. Being safe once, in one match, against one opponent, is not particularly difficult. Being consistently safe, across hundreds of matches, against opponents of every possible size and style, over the course of years or even decades, is one of the hardest things to achieve in the entire industry. Calaway worked with hundreds of different performers throughout his 30-year career. Only a small handful of them earned the kind of complete, repeated trust that this list represents. That rarity is exactly what makes each name on this countdown so significant, and it is exactly why fans should pay close attention to the reasoning behind each choice, not just the order in which they appear. This list has not come from a single official announcement. Calaway has never sat down and published one formal ranking with a title like Top 10 Safest Wrestlers. Instead, this picture has been built up gradually, across years of interviews, his own podcast called 6 Feet Under with Mark Calaway, and a number of long-form shoot interviews where he has spoken openly and honestly about his career. When you look across everything he has said in those different settings, the same names keep appearing again and again. That kind of consistency, repeated across years of separate conversations, is what makes this list so reliable. These are not one-time compliments handed out in a single interview. They are opinions Calaway has held and repeated consistently, about performers who protected him across an entire career, built on physical risk. Now it is time to count down the 10 wrestlers Calaway repeatedly named as the safest, most trusted performers he ever stepped into the ring with. We will start from number 10 and work our way down to the one performer who stood above everybody else. Number 10 on this list is Brock Lesnar. On paper, Lesnar does not sound like someone who belongs on a list about safety. His entire style is built around explosive power. He is famous for his suplexes, a style so aggressive it earned the nickname Suplex City. But Calaway saw something in Lesnar that a lot of fans might miss. Underneath all that power was an athlete with extraordinary body control. Lesnar was once an NCAA Division I heavyweight champion in amateur wrestling. That background gave him a deep understanding of balance and how to control his own center of mass, along with the center of mass of whoever he was working with. Calaway pointed out that when Lesnar hit his finishing move, the F5, he kept complete control over his opponent's trajectory through the air. He made sure they landed flat on their back instead of at some awkward, dangerous angle. Lesnar's raw strength let him hold onto his opponent securely, even during complicated sequences, which meant that even the biggest and most physical matches with him ended with a safe landing. Lesnar's archetype is best described as a power athlete, and his primary safety mechanism came down to core balance combined with controlled force decay. In simple terms, that means he knew how to slow down the energy of a move as it happened, instead of letting all of it hit his opponent at once. That is not something every powerful wrestler can do. Plenty of strong athletes can lift someone off the ground. Very few can lift someone up, control the entire arc of their fall, and set them down in a way that looks explosive on camera while staying safe underneath. Calaway recognized that Lesnar belonged in a small group of exceptional heavyweights who could manage that balance every single time, which is exactly why his legacy among his peers is built around exceptional heavyweight control. Number 9 is Rey Mysterio. This one might surprise people even more than Lesnar, especially given what happened between him and Calaway later on, which we will get to. But when it comes to pure technical safety, Mysterio was one of the most precise workers in wrestling history. Standing at just 5 foot 6 inches tall, noticeably smaller than most of his opponents, he built an entire career around working with much bigger performers, and that requires an extreme level of timing and trust. Calaway praised the way Mysterio moved through the air during high-flying moves like Hurricane Ranas and seated sentons. Because Mysterio was so light, his bigger partners could catch him safely without straining a joint or colliding awkwardly. His agility was a big part of what made those size mismatch matches, the small high flyer against the giant, look completely convincing while staying physically safe for both men involved. Mysterio's archetype is the high flyer, and his primary safety mechanism is what can be described as aerial weight drift combined with micro-precision. Because his opponents were so often far larger than him, the responsibility for keeping those matches safe fell heavily onto Mysterio's own body control. He had to judge exactly how his weight would shift in the air, adjust his positioning constantly, and land his moves with a level of accuracy that left almost no margin for error. That is part of why Calaway, despite everything that happened between them later, still names Mysterio among the safest partners of his entire career. His legacy is built around being a light, precise, airborne partner who made dangerous-looking dives repeatable and safe, match after match. Number 8 is The Big Show, also known as Paul White. Standing over 7 feet tall and weighing as much as 500 pounds, White had one of the toughest and most demanding jobs in the entire wrestling business. He was constantly asked to catch smaller, more acrobatic wrestlers as they flew through the air, and to support other big men during power moves. Calaway, who acted as something of a mentor to White early in his career, praised his careful mechanics. White's biggest strength as a safe worker was his ability to act like a stable, dependable base. He could absorb the force of an incoming opponent and lower them down to the mat gently, instead of letting them crash. Because of this reputation, White was often paired with celebrities and less experienced performers who needed guaranteed protection in the ring. White's archetype fits the description of a supergiant, and his primary safety mechanism is best described as cushion catching combined with base stabilization. Think about what it actually takes to catch a smaller wrestler flying through the air at speed, then lower them down without hurting either person. It requires enormous strength, but it also requires a very gentle, controlled touch, which is a combination that not every big man in wrestling history has managed to master. White managed both, which is why WWE management trusted him again and again, with performers who could not afford to take a rough landing, earning him a legacy as a trusted giant mentor across the locker room. Number 7 is Stone Cold Steve Austin. After suffering a serious neck injury in 1997, Austin had to completely change how he wrestled. He moved away from the high-flying, technical style he once used, and shifted toward straightforward brawling. That change forced him to rely on extremely precise striking and positioning, since his body could no longer absorb the same level of physical stress. Calaway pointed to Austin's reliability throughout the Attitude Era, noting that his punches, stomps, and signature moves looked crisp and violent on camera, while remaining completely safe for his opponents to actually receive. Austin built his entire in-ring approach around clear communication and simple, dependable execution, which made him one of the most trusted names Calaway ever worked opposite. Austin's archetype is best described as a striking brawler, and his primary safety mechanism was fundamental placement, combined with crisp, clean delivery. After his neck injury, Austin no longer had the physical margin for reckless, high-risk offense. So instead of trying to keep up with flashier, more dangerous styles, he leaned into simplicity. Every stomp, every punch, every stunner was placed exactly where it needed to be, with no wasted motion and no guesswork involved. That discipline is exactly what earned him the reputation as a safe, high-pressure worker. Someone who could headline the biggest shows in the company without putting his opponents, or himself, at unnecessary risk. Number 6 is Kurt Angle. Angle brought something into professional wrestling that very few performers ever had: real Olympic-level amateur wrestling ability. That background gave him an unusually precise level of control, both over his own body and over the body of whoever he was working with. Calaway explained that working with Angle allowed for extremely physical matches, including heavy overhead suplexes and tight submission transitions, without putting anyone's neck at real risk. Angle's amateur background meant he could judge spatial positioning while a move was still happening, adjusting his grip and angle mid-lift so that his opponent landed safely across their shoulder blades rather than on their head or neck. Angle's archetype is the elite amateur, and his primary safety mechanism can be summed up as kinetic precision combined with careful control of suplex trajectory. Amateur wrestling, at the level Angle competed at, trains an athlete to understand leverage, balance, and momentum in a way that very few professional wrestlers ever pick up naturally. That flawless transfer of amateur skill into a professional setting is exactly what made him such a reliable opponent for Calaway. Even in matches built around big, aggressive power moves, Angle's suplexes never carried the same risk that the same moves carried in less experienced hands. Number 5 is Triple H, also known as Paul Levesque. Levesque built his in-ring career around a steady, methodical style of ring generalship. Calaway credited him for the way he paced his matches, taking his time through transitions instead of rushing, which cut down significantly on the chances of a mistake happening. Levesque's physical approach focused heavily on structural safety. During high-impact sequences, he kept tight, deliberate control over his opponent's torso and neck to make sure every move landed smoothly. That reliability made him a trusted opponent for major matches across Calaway's career, including a run of intense encounters at WrestleMania. Levesque's archetype fits the methodical brawler, and his primary safety mechanism is best summed up as controlled pacing combined with joint protection. Rather than rushing through a match at high speed, Levesque preferred to build his matches gradually, giving every transition enough time to be executed properly. That patience is not always exciting to watch on paper, but it is exactly the kind of approach that removes the rushed, panicked moments where accidents tend to happen. Because of that consistency, Levesque earned a reputation across the locker room as a high-trust anchor, someone who could be relied on in the biggest matches on the card. We are now halfway through this countdown, and the standard only gets higher from here. The 5 wrestlers still to come, right up near the very top of this list, did not just avoid serious accidents. According to Calaway, they represent the closest thing wrestling has to a guarantee of safety, even during the most dangerous, high-impact sequences imaginable. Number 4 is Shawn Michaels. Widely considered by Calaway to be the greatest pure in-ring performer in wrestling history, Michaels earned his high safety rating through elite spatial awareness, precise timing, and an unmatched ability to take bumps safely. During his biggest matches against Calaway, especially their famous encounters at WrestleMania, Michaels controlled the tempo of the entire match to avoid any misaligned landings. He was especially skilled at positioning his body for catches during high-risk dives, smoothly absorbing kinetic energy in a way that protected both himself and his opponent. Michaels fits the archetype of a ring general, and his primary safety mechanism combines spatial positioning with expert bump timing. A great deal of his reputation as the greatest in-ring performer of all time comes down to storytelling, but that storytelling was only possible because his fundamentals were so incredibly safe and reliable underneath it all. He knew exactly when to take a bump, exactly how to angle his body on a landing, and exactly how to set up his opponent for the next spot without ever rushing the process. That combination of artistry and precision is why his legacy is so often described using 2 words together: elite storytelling partner. Number 3 is Yokozuna, also known as Rodney Anoa'i. At a working weight that shifted between 500 and 600 pounds, Yokozuna should have been one of the most physically demanding opponents in wrestling history. Instead, Calaway repeatedly described working with him as remarkably light and effortless. Anoa'i had exceptional control over his own center of gravity and incredible leg strength. His signature move, the bonsai drop, involved him leaping from the corner and landing directly on top of a downed opponent. Despite how dangerous that sounds, Anoa'i executed it with precise weight offloading technique. He held onto the ropes and landed mostly on his feet and thighs, dramatically softening the impact on the wrestler underneath him. Calaway once described the feeling of receiving Yokozuna's biggest moves as being like a feather pillow landing on you. Their close personal friendship backstage only strengthened the trust they shared inside the ring. Yokozuna's archetype is the ultra heavyweight, and his primary safety mechanism came from weight offloading, combined with a strong foot and thigh base. Carrying that much body weight into a ring full-time is already a serious physical challenge, but doing it while also protecting every single opponent he worked with is a completely different level of skill. Very few wrestlers of his size in history have ever been described the way Calaway described him, as the lightest contact giant in the business. That single description says everything about how much control Anoa'i had over a body that large, and it is exactly why he remains one of the most respected big men in wrestling history. Only one name remains after this, which tells you exactly how much respect Calaway holds for the next two performers on this list. Number 2 is Bret Hart, known to fans as the Hitman. Across a 23-year career, Hart maintained something almost unheard of in wrestling, a record of never causing an in-ring injury to an opponent. Calaway praised Hart's ability to wrestle in an intensely physical, snug style while staying completely safe for whoever was across the ring from him. Hart's safety came down to precision. Every strike he threw was placed with exact leverage, and his submission holds, like his famous sharpshooter, created tension without putting real strain on ligaments or joints. Even during one of the most tense periods in wrestling history, following the controversial 1997 Montreal Screwjob, Calaway spoke about his complete trust in Hart, pointing to Hart's deep commitment to professional standards and the fact that no opponent was ever placed in real danger under his care. Hart's archetype is the technical master, and his primary safety mechanism came down to geometrical precision combined with careful lever control. Every hold he applied, every strike he threw, was measured with an almost mathematical level of accuracy. That is an incredibly difficult thing to maintain over a 23-year career, especially while wrestling some of the most physical, hard-hitting styles the business has ever produced. A zero-injury record over that many years, against that many different kinds of opponents, is not luck. It is the result of relentless attention to detail, match after match, night after night, and it is exactly why Calaway continued to point to Hart as one of the safest workers he ever encountered. Number 1, the safest wrestler Calaway has ever named, is Kane, also known as Glenn Jacobs. Jacobs stands out as Calaway's top pick for the safest big man in wrestling history. At 7 feet tall and over 300 pounds, Jacobs combined enormous physical power with an unusual level of muscular control. Across hundreds of matches with Calaway, both as his tag team partner in the Brothers of Destruction and as his rival, Jacobs performed heavy slams, choke slams, and even Tombstone Piledrivers with complete precision. Calaway has explained that working with Jacobs required almost no defensive effort on his part, because Jacobs took full responsibility for his partner's safety during every lift. He absorbed impact through his own legs and knees, protecting his opponent's neck in the process. That reputation made Jacobs one of the most trusted figures backstage, someone WWE relied on to mentor new big men and safely introduce them to top-level in-ring work. Jacobs fits the archetype of a super heavyweight, and his primary safety mechanism combines strength deceleration with what can be described as a cushion base, meaning his own body worked like a shock absorber for every move he performed. That is an extremely rare skill among wrestlers his size. Most big men struggle to control that much body weight through a fast-moving sequence, let alone control it while also protecting a partner as large and as physical as Calaway himself. Jacobs did this consistently, across hundreds of matches, over the course of an entire career spent standing directly across from one of the most dangerous performers in wrestling history. That consistency is exactly why he sits at number 1 on this list. Not because he was the most exciting or the most decorated, but because he was, in Calaway's own estimation, the premier heavy base in the business, the one performer who made every single dangerous moment between them feel completely safe. It is worth pointing out that this list is not limited to just one period of Calaway's career. It stretches across the different eras he wrestled through, from the more theatrical early days of the promotion, through the intense, hard-hitting Attitude Era, and into the modern, corporate version of the business. Wrestlers like Bret Hart and Yokozuna represent the earlier chapters of his career, while performers like Kurt Angle and Brock Lesnar represent later chapters, closer to the modern era. The fact that Calaway found trustworthy, safe opponents in every single era he competed in says a great deal about his own ability to adapt, and about the wrestling industry's ongoing effort to protect its performers even as the style of the business changed dramatically over time. Those are the 10 wrestlers Calaway trusted more than anyone else in his entire career. But to really understand why that trust mattered so much, it helps to look at what happens when safety breaks down. Not every match went as smoothly as the ones with the wrestlers on this list, and some of the worst moments of Calaway's career came from situations that had nothing to do with wrestlers on the top 10. Industry analysts who study these kinds of incidents usually separate them into three different categories. There is reckless execution, which comes from poor technique or a genuine lack of skill. There is a freak traumatic accident, which happens when two skilled performers still end up in an unexpected, unlucky position. And there is acute physical failure, which happens when fatigue, illness, or an existing injury causes a wrestler's body to simply stop cooperating in the middle of a move. Looking at real examples from Calaway's career shows exactly how different these three categories are from one another, and why blaming every injury on carelessness would be completely unfair. One of the clearest examples of reckless execution happened in late 1995, during a match against Nelson Frazier Jr., who wrestled under the name Mabel and later became known as Viscera. Frazier weighed around 500 pounds and had a reputation for rough, unsafe ring mechanics. During an overhead body slam, Frazier lost control of his own weight and dropped his full body weight directly onto Calaway's face. The impact was severe. It crushed roughly 90% of Calaway's orbital floor, the bone that supports the eye socket, and left his optic nerve resting dangerously against broken bone fragments. Surgeons had to insert an artificial plate just to save his eyesight. That injury is the real reason Calaway started wearing his gray phantom mask when he returned to the ring, protecting his face while it healed. This incident sits firmly in the category of negligent or reckless execution. The primary failure cause was a straightforward lack of weight control and poor technique, not bad luck. The anatomic impact zone was Calaway's facial skeleton, specifically the orbital floor beneath his eye. The long-term result was permanent enough that it changed his in-ring look for years afterward, through that gray phantom mask. When people talk about wrestlers who were considered unsafe to work with, this match is often used as the clearest possible example of what unsafe technique actually looks like in practice, and it stands in sharp contrast to every performer on the top 10 list. A very different kind of accident happened on May 28, 2010, this time involving Rey Mysterio, one of the wrestlers on this very list. Mysterio attempted his signature seated senton from the top rope, a move designed to land safely across Calaway's upper chest. But due to a slight misjudgment in distance, Mysterio landed higher than planned and struck Calaway directly across the bridge of his nose. The collision fractured Calaway's nose, caused a serious concussion, and broke his other orbital floor, leaving him with permanent double vision at the edges of his sight. Despite how serious the injury was, Calaway never blamed Mysterio for what happened. He understood that this was an accidental positioning error between two experienced professionals, not a case of carelessness or poor technique. This incident belongs in a completely different category to the Mabel injury. The primary failure cause here was a minor positional calculation error, not a lack of skill. The anatomic impact zone shifted slightly, striking the bridge of the nose and the second orbital floor, and the long-term result was permanent peripheral double vision rather than a full loss of the orbital floor. Workplace categorization for this kind of event is described as an unintentional acute accident, which is a very different label from reckless execution. It is a powerful reminder that even elite, trusted performers, people who spent their entire careers protecting the wrestlers around them, can still make small, unintentional mistakes. Those mistakes are simply part of a sport built on split-second timing, and they are very different from reckless or careless wrestling. The third example took place at WWE Super Showdown in 2019, during a match between Calaway and Bill Goldberg. Before the match even started, Goldberg accidentally concussed himself during his pre-match ritual when he headbutted a steel locker door. Once the match began, a combination of extreme heat, Goldberg's age, his active concussion, and limited conditioning caused his motor control to break down. This led to a botched jackhammer attempt where Goldberg lost his leverage completely, causing Calaway to drop directly onto the top of his head and neck. Thankfully, Calaway avoided a catastrophic neck injury, but the moment highlighted exactly how dangerous high-impact moves become when a wrestler's balance, fatigue, or physical condition is compromised before they even step into the ring. This incident falls into the third category, acute physical failure driven by conditioning and pre-existing trauma. The primary failure cause was Goldberg's pre-match concussion, combined with extreme fatigue, not a lack of technical skill on his part under normal circumstances. The anatomic impact zone was Calaway's cervical spine and the base of his skull, arguably the most dangerous possible area for something to go wrong. The long-term result was serious enough that it reportedly led to conversations about retirement. This event is categorized as a conditioning and trauma failure, distinct from both the reckless execution seen with Mabel and the accidental positioning error seen with Mysterio. These three moments show three completely different ways that ring safety can break down. Mabel's incident came from poor technique and a lack of weight control. Mysterio's incident came from a tiny, unintentional positioning mistake. Goldberg's incident came from fatigue and an injury that happened before the match even began. None of these were about bad intentions in the way people sometimes assume. They were about how fragile the balance of safety really is, even for experienced professionals working at the highest level of the industry. Calaway's 30-year career stands as proof of his own exceptional skill, but it also stands as a tribute to the wrestlers who helped protect him along the way, match after match, night after night, across 3 different eras of the business. These 10 performers earned something that very few names in wrestling history can claim. They earned the complete trust of The Undertaker, a man who put his body on the line more often, and more dangerously, than almost anyone else who ever stepped into that ring. If there is one thing to take away from this entire list, it is that greatness in wrestling is not only measured by championships, main events, or how loud the crowd screams on a given night. It is also measured by something quieter, something that rarely gets its own highlight package or its own chant from the crowd. It is measured by whether the people who stepped into the ring with you walked out safely, over and over again, for years on end, match after match, across an entire career. By that measure, these 10 wrestlers achieved something that very few performers in the history of the business ever will, something that no championship belt could ever fully represent. And when it came to that kind of trust, in that kind of business, no one truly came close.